Many thanks to my supporters on Patreon. If you'd like to join them, check the link in the description. But now, enjoy the video. Welcome back to Gran Turismo Origins. This is the ongoing series where I'm diving into each of the first 6 mainline GT games. In my opinion, these games define what Gran Turismo is, and yet they all differ from each other in many different ways. These videos are my way of making sense of everything as we fully dissect these games. We're covering pretty much every aspect of them, from the menus and music to the fundamental game design. But not only are we looking back at them retrospectively, we're also considering how they were viewed at the time. By doing all of this, hopefully we can gain a deeper understanding on what makes these games tick and how each of them fits into the broader story of this series. Today, we're diving into perennial fan favourites, Gran Turismo 4. Gran Turismo 3 had been on the market for roughly 2 years already when its successor was announced, the creatively titled Gran Turismo 4. First seen in action at E3 in 2003, the series' second entry on the PlayStation 2 aimed to take its first and expand and enhance pretty much every aspect of it. More cars, more tracks, more realistic handling and visuals, and more features. When it came to the scope of content on offer, it was clear to see what Polyphony were aiming for through early screenshots and demos. With the car roster in particular, Kaz himself expressed a desire to not only represent makes and models from around the world, but also throughout history, right back to the very first automobiles. On the features front, whilst model car damage had been suggested yet again, this was very quickly shot down, with the reluctance of car makers to see their models get dinged up being the main reason cited. The planned online version of GT3 never came to fruition, so with GT4, online play was touted as a feature from day one. Whilst GT4 looked very impressive even at this early stage, Polyphony knew that the game wasn't going to enjoy the same benefit of the graphical leap that GT3 had. In this respect, it had to find other ways to impress. In the games up until this point, human characters didn't really exist, with people just being represented as a massive blurry pixels. GT4 planned to change this, with there now being fully modelled and animated people. The best example of this being the pit crew who would work on your car during pit stops. Beyond this, there would be new side modes as well. Photo travel was announced as a feature that allowed players to take pictures of their cars in various locations across the globe. There would also be B-Spec, a somewhat unusual mode where rather than driving the car yourself, it would be left to an AI driver who you could then direct with various instructions. As the scope of GT4 continued to increase, the game was pushed back further and further from its initial Christmas 2003 estimate, a somewhat familiar story by this point in the franchise. However, to help fill this void, a demo of the game called Gran Turismo 4 Prologue was made available in Asia and PAL regions starting in late 2003. This limited version of the game not only gave players a sneak preview of the real thing, but it also served as an introduction to the series for newer players, with much of it being license test style challenges aimed at teaching driving techniques. After the series' longest delay yet, the full GT4 would release in Japan at the end of December 2004 and the first quarter of 2005 in most other regions. At this point, the series stock had never been higher. After its breakout success just a few years earlier, GT3 had again redefined what was possible for a racing game with its sheer level of depth and quality. Given that it already had such a strong foundation to build off, GT4's potential was through the roof. But given that Gran Turismo was by now the clear top dog in the racing genre, the expectations of the series were also sky high. Could this game make full use of its expanded assets to raise the bar even further? Pretty much immediately, we can tell that there are some major differences when it comes to the presentation of this game. Where the first 3 games all felt like they followed a similar theme, GT4's menus give off a totally different vibe. The darker contrasts have been thrown out in favour of a much more subdued appearance where colour is used very sparingly. As you can see, orange highlights do still appear in places, but overall it feels much more restrained than the previous games. To go with this more toned down aesthetic, we also have a far more relaxed soundtrack. Honestly, it's so different to the previous games that it's kind of hard to believe it was all composed by the same person. In fact, a few of the songs are even remixes of those from the past games, although some of them sound so different that you may not even notice. Even though I personally prefer the more energetic songs from GT3, there's no denying that this is a really superb soundtrack. Isamu Ohira is still at the top of his game. I also love the new map and 3D menu icons as well. Everything being so spread out implies a sort of grandiose scale, almost like you're going on some sort of world tour. Where the previous games felt very rooted in the 90s and early 2000s, GT4's aesthetic feels somewhat timeless. If I'd never played this game before and someone showed me these menus telling me it just came out yesterday, I would probably believe them. And when you consider this visual style within the context of the series as a whole, it gets even more interesting. As I mentioned, tonally it feels far removed from GT1, 2, and 3, but it's a fair bit different to the games that come after it as well. If anything, it kind of represents a unique midpoint between two distinct eras of this series, and as such it stands on its own. This unique aspect, no matter how minor, is something that I always value when coming back to GT4. At this point, you won't be surprised to hear that this game had very impressive visuals for the time. It essentially took GT3's graphics and added an even higher level of fidelity. GT4 is one of a very small number of PS2 games that can run at 1080i high definition, and as such, the emulator footage you're seeing right now doesn't look too far off from how this game appears natively on console. The key word with GT4's visuals is realism. It's something that Polyphony has always strived for, but in this game, I feel like the overall visual design has been entirely centered around it. For example, if we compare Trial Mountain in GT3 to Trial Mountain in GT4, you can see how different it appears, even though the track environment itself hasn't changed massively. It's mostly down to the lighting and color palette. GT4's version is noticeably toned down and has a much more earthy feel. There's no doubt that these visuals are more true to real life. In fact, GT3 looks a bit cartoony in comparison, but ultimately, whether you consider this an improvement will depend on your own preference. Whilst this game is still capable of looking stunning in various different locations and conditions, particularly at some of the new original circuits, I do feel like they went a bit too far in the other direction. I think it says something when one of the most common mods for people to do to this game is increase the saturation and vibrancy. In its standard form, it's just a bit too washed out. On the driving front, again we can discover some pretty drastic differences from the previous game. What's important to note is that where GT4 was initially built on the same game engine as GT3, and so was GT4 Prologue as well, by the time it released, it was on an entirely new engine. This goes some way to explain why early reports noted that the handling was very similar to GT3's. If you've played the final game, you'll know that it's now completely different. The cars pitch and roll far more, weight transfer is very pronounced. Overall, this makes the driving physics feel a lot more dynamic, but at the same time, it gives it a noticeable learning curve. When combined with somewhat oversensitive steering controls, this can make handling certain cars quite a challenge. If you're too aggressive with your inputs, you can often get locked into massive amounts of understeer or sudden oversteer. On PAL, this is even more challenging as the cars are less stable than on NTSC releases owing to the difference in frame rates. Now, something I should mention is that I don't normally play racing games from a third-person view. I much prefer bumper cam, or as these games like to put it, normal view, because I'm normal, I guess. But the reason why I'm doing so in these videos is because being able to see the car makes the gameplay footage look a lot better. Anyway, the reason why I'm bringing this up now is because a very common complaint with this game is how the chase cam is so rigidly locked to the rear of the car that it makes it difficult to understand how it's moving in the corners. This will also continue to be a problem with the games going forward. Combine this with the twitchy handling model, and the fact that I'm already not a big fan of third-person views, and this explains why you might notice that my driving in this video is a little bit sloppier than usual. I think it's fair to say that GT4's handling is not quite as intuitive as GT3's, but again, the counterpoint is its simulation value. Whilst GT3 was the first game to be designed with racing wheels in mind, with GT4, it really seems like the game was meant to be played on one. Many real-life racing drivers praised this game's handling at the time, including Sebastian Loeb, who famously used it to practice for his first attempt at the 24 Hours of Le Mans in 2005. Full disclosure, I've never played GT4 on a wheel, but given the evidence, I think it's safe to say that it's a lot more enjoyable than on a standard controller. You know what's something that people don't talk about often enough with GT4? The in-race music. As part of my analysis, I like to understand the broader themes of the soundtrack and how this ties into the overall tone of the game, but I simply can't do that here. Take a listen to a selection of these songs and tell me if you can think of any common through line that connects them. The variety here is quite absurd, and when you then consider that the PAL and NTSC-J soundtracks have a bunch of exclusive songs on top of this, it gets even weirder. I will say that I do enjoy the majority of tunes here, but as a complete soundtrack, it's just really bizarre. I guess the only real consistency comes from the handful of new original songs from Daiki Kasho. If I try to think of a general tone for GT4's in-race music, this is normally what comes to my mind first. In terms of the intros, again there's an interesting variety of songs. The PAL version uses Reason is Treason by Kasabian, and even though this is the one that I grew up listening to, I never felt like it really fits. North America got Van Halen's Panama, which I played earlier. Obviously for a racing game it works well, but I just don't feel like 80s hard rock / glam metal really represents GT4 as a game. So that just leaves the Japanese version and Moon Over the Castle as my personal favourites. Even though it appears in all 3 intros, I want to highlight the orchestral build-up in particular, which is possibly the best in the entire series. As I discussed at length, the biggest letdown with GT3 from most people's point of view was the limited car selection. Having almost 4 years to develop its sequel on the same console, this is something that they were able to rectify in GT4, and boy did they. Polyphony didn't just aim to expand on GT3 here, they wanted to surpass even GT2. So when the game released with more than 700 different car models, it was mission accomplished. But let's dive into what that number really represents. Almost every car from GT3 was carried over. As I mentioned last time, GT3's car list has a really solid variety, but just lacks depth in many areas. Naturally, GT4 expands on these areas, as well as adding many of the latest models that came out since then, and plenty of fascinating left field choices too. Sadly, many of the premium European brands are still missing, but these are the only real notable absences. For the most part, if you can think of a car that came out before 2005, it's almost certainly in this game. If GT2 was the game that expanded the car list when it came to representing a wide variety of countries, then GT4 does the same when it comes to representing different eras of automotive history. There is a noticeable effort to include older cars that were somewhat neglected in the previous games, dating back to the first car ever, the Benz patent Motorwagen. Putting these cars in their own Legends showroom for each brand is a nice touch as well. It's worth noting that in between GT3 and GT4, there was Gran Turismo Concept. This was a GT3-based spin-off title that showcased the latest models and concept cars seen at various motor shows across the world, and almost all of these cars were carried into GT4. So, when you consider everything, GT4 represents the past, present, and future of automobiles all in one game. With the increase in cars also comes an increase in tracks. Of the newcomers, what's most notable is the influx of real-world circuits, from Suzuka in Japan to Infineon Raceway in the US, and of course the fearsome Nürburgring Nordschleife in Germany. Having only featured a whopping 2 real-world circuits prior to GT4, it really seems like this was the point where they decided that they could model real tracks to a high enough standard to feature widely in these games. The only caveat is that as the game still doesn't have a way to prevent corner cutting, you can cheese many of these circuits very easily. Whilst having these famous circuits is of course great, I've personally always been a lot more interested in the unique original designs, of which there are also plenty in GT4. Not only do we have a massive selection of returnees from the first 3 games, but many new and interesting ones. There's the likes of El Capitan and the Driving Park Complex, dirt courses like Grand Canyon and Cathedral Rocks, as well as Chamonix and Ice Arena, which brings snow circuits to the series. However, the most prominent ones have to be the street tracks. GT4 brought so many new city-based circuits. From the fast and open ones like Seoul Central and New York, to the tight and twisty ones such as Opera Paris and Hong Kong, to the really tight and twisty ones of George V Paris and Cité d'Aria. Of course, not every track will be to your personal preference, but there's almost bound to be at least one newcomer that you really enjoy. Even though GT3 overhauled the career structure, this didn't mean that things were going to stay the same in GT4. In fact, there are some really big differences. Well, I guess we should start at the license center. It's pretty much tradition at this point. Again, not a lot has changed here. The tests themselves aren't too hard to pass. In fact, they're a bit easier than GT3's. The rally license is no more, with tests on these circuits instead being incorporated into the normal licenses. Oh yeah, and instead of 8 tests per license, there are now 16. Wait, what? Yep, excluding GT7's master license, GT4 has by far the most license tests of any Gran Turismo game. Now, if license tests were a fun part of the game that everyone could enjoy, that would be great. But unfortunately, for most people they're just a tedious roadblock to get through before you can actually enjoy the game. And it's not as if GT4 helps itself either. This game features tests called one-lap guide runs, where you have to follow a pace car around a full lap. They're not particularly hard, just a bit frustrating and a massive time sink. Seriously, outside of the S license, there should never be tests that last for more than 2 minutes. And don't even get me started on IA-15. What makes things even worse is that many tests force you to have stability control on, which is like trying to run a 100-meter sprint with your shoes tied together. It's just miserable. But it's okay because at least we have coffee breaks, aka optional bonus tests. Hooray. Really, the only redeeming feature is the fail music. That never gets old. But being serious, GT4 is the first game to award prize cars for all bronze and all silver. This means that you've at least always got something to look forward to. Of course, if you decide to do the licenses first, you can always use one of these cars as your starter, but if not, then it's off to the dealers. After a brief absence, use dealerships return. In GT4 there are 3, one for 1980s cars, one for early 90s cars, and one for late 90s cars. In a sense, this feels a lot like GT2, where your 10,000 credits is more than enough to get a pretty decent starter. From there, it's off to the races, where you should be able to clean out the early events with no real issue. In terms of the AI opponents, yet again improvements were promised. Human AI was the tagline that was thrown about initially, with the CPU drivers supposedly able to make more human-like decisions. So, do they live up to their billing? Again, it's another swing and a miss. To be honest, I don't really notice much difference to how they were in GT3. They're decently fast and can give you a good challenge under the right conditions, but they're still just as clueless in wheel-to-wheel racing. Now, the AI obviously didn't get worse in this game, but for me, they always felt somehow more annoying to race against. For a while, I didn't understand this, but the reason actually has to do with the physics. You see, in GT3, if you collided with another car or a wall, it was pretty easy to recover without losing too much time. In GT4, thanks to the more expressive handling and weight transfer, it's a lot easier to lose control of your car. As such, in these situations where you get hit by an AI or pushed onto the grass, you're more likely to spin out or lose time in other ways. In essence, there's somewhat an imbalance between the more sophisticated physics and the not so sophisticated AI drivers. GT4 does introduce rolling starts in some races, so naturally the field will be more spread out. But this does have the side effect of making these races harder as the leader starts further ahead. This game also features A-spec points, which help you to gauge how difficult a race will be based on the performance of your car versus your opponent's. They range from 1 point to 200 points, 1 implying a very easy race, and 200 a very difficult one. For the most part, this works as intended and helps you to understand roughly how much of a challenge each race will be. It's just a shame that earning A-spec points doesn't actually do anything beyond being a meaningless stat. Okay then, let's talk about the general career structure. Now, unlike GT3, it's worth noting that the events are not all neatly contained within one menu. They're instead spread out all over the main map. But somewhat like GT3, to beat the game you need to win all of the events in the beginner and professional areas. However, the game has a lot more to offer than just that, with specific event halls for European, Japanese, and American cars, as well as separate one-make events and special conditions events, i.e. rally. There's also endurance races and extreme events, which we'll talk more about later. Anyway, you can probably see how this career structure is something of a hybrid between GT3's and the ones from the first 2 games. The events outside of the beginner and professional leagues are entirely optional, but you are incentivized to check them out as they offer more ways to earn money and prize cards. Given that most brands have specific one-make events, which unlike GT2's do give out prize cards as well, this creates many different branching paths depending on which car you start with. But if you want to, you can just stick to the events in the beginner and professional leagues and your experience will be more like GT3, with its gradual progression. It's worth noting that many single race events now comprise of 5 races instead of just 3. I don't really know why they made this change, especially for events in the early game. We do not need 5 races in the Sunday Cup. Anyway, you know the drill. Win events, earn prize cars, buy and upgrade cars to use in tougher events, etc. However, when you do eventually look beyond the main path and into some of the other events, you will discover something pretty interesting. The special conditions events are one place you might head to fairly early on. Unlike GT3, these events feel much more incorporated into the rest of the career. For one, you don't need a specific license just for them, and on the easy level, you'll be up against modest road cars. The fact that there are also some events on tarmac circuits lowers the barrier to entry even further, as you don't have to splash out on tyres. For the most part, I really enjoy these events, but they're certainly not perfect. On dirt and snow, the handling is very twitchy and hard to gauge. Also, to prevent players from just bulldozing their way past the AI, there's a penalty system. In theory that's fine, but in practice not so much, especially when the AI can't be penalised even when they definitely deserve it. These factors can make these events pretty frustrating at times. Seriously, Whistler Ice Race Hard is up there as one of my all-time least favourite GT events. But when you are able to have a decently clean race with the AI, it can be pretty intense and a lot of fun. And the fact that there are so many events on so many different types of circuits means that it doesn't ever get tedious. As I've established, these events can be accessed pretty early on in the game, but doing so may lead to some unexpected situations. Let's take the Capri Rally Easy as an example, where this Audi Quattro can easily be beaten with a solid starter car. However, when you finish the 2 races here, you're greeted by... excuse me? Yes, a 400 plus horsepower rally raid machine is your prize for this pretty basic event that takes all of 10 minutes. If you played GT4 before, you almost certainly know about this already, and probably see where I'm going with this, because the point isn't just to highlight this one event, but rather the phenomenon of broken prize cars in GT4. In fact, last year I made a whole video detailing several different events that give you prize cars which are far better than the car you actually need to beat them. It's very much a trend, and it's not hard to understand why they did this. With GT3, we mentioned how the relatively slow prize cars in the early game made progression quite difficult for some players. It seems like the decision to sprinkle in a few overpowered prize cars in GT4's early game events was a way to make sure that didn't happen again, although they definitely overcorrected. Much like GT2, you can earn multiple prize cars from events by clearing your progress and winning them again. Many of these prize cars, like the RSC, can be sold for big money, so this creates an exploit similar to the one from GT2 with the TVR Speed 12. Now, the decision to give out these busted prize cars is one thing, and to a degree I can understand this, as it's an easy way to ensure that players will sample a wide variety of the many interesting cars on offer. However, making these prize cars an infinite resource I find very strange. Now, some players might not see this as a problem, and even a positive as it gives them a way to earn insane amounts of cash, but from a game designer's perspective, I really don't understand it at all. Why would you deliberately create a situation that incentivizes players to spend their time continually replaying the same event over and over again, rather than experiencing the rest of the game where they can earn more cars and money in a far more organic way? With GT2, we could chalk that up to inexperience with game design, but given how tightly designed GT3's career was, they don't really have an excuse anymore. However, they didn't drop the ball entirely. To prevent the situation we saw in GT2 from happening again, where the game basically becomes a joke from this point onwards as you have so much money that you can do whatever you want to, GT4 has some restrictions. You see, a lot of the events for the higher end cars can be found in the Extreme League. But how do you unlock the Extreme League? Well, you have to beat the GT World Championship. However, to unlock the GT World Championship, you first have to beat all of the other events in the beginner and professional leagues. And guess what? Those 2 leagues are pretty much the only event areas in the entire game without any overpowered prize cars. Is this just a coincidence? From my point of view, no, not at all. Say what you will about these design choices, but to me it's very clear that they designed it this way on purpose. On the surface, it might seem similar to GT2, but clearly a lot more thought has gone into this career. Because sure, you can get some ridiculously fast cars ridiculously early in the game, but to beat the thing, you'll still need to build a diverse collection of cars to use in different events. You can't just brute force your way through like you could in GT2. Ultimately, the game gives you enough freedom to carve out your own distinct path, where you'll build up your own unique collection of cars depending on which events you do and in what order, but restricts you just enough to the point where you still have to make decisions and strategize in the long term. Being able to earn 1 or 2 overpowered cars isn't enough to break the game. Obviously, this solution isn't perfect. Being forced to race a K car when you know you have an LM race car sitting in the garage but can't use it for much without clearing out these events first is kind of paradoxical when you really think about it. However, I think the strategic element in how you acquire the cars you need to beat these events, both through the main career path and the other events, is what keeps it interesting. There is a reason why this game is so popular for challenge runs. Like I say, this is somewhat diluted by knowing that in just a few trips to Amalfi, you can make enough money to avoid having to consider any sort of strategy beyond just buying the best car you can afford for a given event, but frankly I think that's the boring option and I would just avoid replaying events entirely. Giving you the freedom to play the game how you want to is one of this series' greatest strengths after all. Arcade mode is back yet again, but not in the same way as before. As I discussed with GT3, in that game it served quite a useful purpose by offering a far more streamlined style of gameplay that almost acted as a counterpoint to the game's somewhat arduous GT mode. In GT4, that isn't really the case, so arcade takes a bit of a back seat. There's no longer any progression, cars and tracks are unlocked through your GT mode progress instead, and winning races doesn't actually achieve anything. It's essentially just a free play mode where you pick a track, pick a car, and just race. But even though arcade mode has been scaled back, this game has plenty more side modes and additional features on offer. A pretty major one is B-Spec, where you direct an AI driver. Rather than being a standalone mode, this is incorporated directly into the career, with most GT mode races allowing you to enter in B-Spec. A neat caveat of this is that it allows you to bypass any license restrictions. As for its functionality, it's pretty basic. You can tell your driver to speed up, slow down, overtake, or make a pit stop. As you use your B-Spec driver more, their stats will gradually increase in an RPG-style fashion. For the most part, I find B-Spec a fun little novelty, but not all too game-changing. The ability to accelerate time is handy though, especially for endurance races as we'll come to later. Beyond the main career events, we also have driving missions. The best way to think about these is that they're a bit like license tests, but instead of beating the clock, you have to beat other cars. These can take the form of simple overtake missions, to multiple lap battles, slipstream challenges, and of course the infamous one-lap magic missions. The last of those has you up against a field of much slower cars that are given a head start, which you have to watch in real time. Some of these can be pretty tough, but I do find them rewarding. Also, given the prize cars on offer, they're definitely worth doing. When it comes to upgrades, for the most part things are still the same, but it's worth noting that Nitrous is now included as an upgrade. This was the early to mid 2000s, remember, so I guess that makes sense. On the setup front, again this is all very familiar. However, as a result of GT4's more detailed handling, I think tuning takes on much more importance in this game. Your suspension setup in particular is very crucial, and a lot of the worst handling cars can be improved quite a bit with just some basic tweaks. If you don't want to dive too much into this though, you can just add ballast, which is a new option, as it's a very quick and easy way to improve balance and traction on certain cars. In GT Auto, you now have the ability to add a custom rear wing to most road cars which gives them adjustable downforce, and also apply OEM wheels from other cars as well as aftermarket ones. Fun fact, this is the only game in the series to have this as an option, and quite frankly, I don't understand why this isn't included in every single racing game that's come out since. Beyond this, customization is still very limited though. But once you've built your ideal machine, there are now more ways to enjoy it. Photo modes are almost ubiquitous in gaming nowadays, but in the mid-2000s not so much. GT4 was really one of the pioneers when it came to in-game photography. You can snap your cars out on the track, or at various picturesque locations across the globe in photo travel. Compared to the newer games, it is a bit clunky and awkward to use, but they had to start somewhere. In the marketing of the game, one of the selling points of this feature was the ability to print out these photos by hooking up a printer directly to your PS2. Let me know if anyone's actually done this, by the way, I'm genuinely curious. Although GT4 doesn't feature an interior view, it does take a step closer, with open-top cars having modelled interiors and fully animated drivers too. Now, let's talk about the late game experience. So the late game of GT4 is kinda weird, mostly because you don't really transition into it. There's a very clear point when you'll realise that you're suddenly there. And this point is once you've beaten all of the other events in the beginner and professional leagues and have unlocked the GT World Championship. If you just follow the main career path, this event will represent an enormous difficulty spike. You'll suddenly go from events for decently fast road cars into a 10-race championship against the fastest Le Mans prototypes in the game. Now, if you do venture into the other areas of the game, you will find some events for race cars that help fill this gap, like the Japanese GT Championship and American Championship for example. These are events for relatively slower race cars that can act as stepping stones into the late game, but it's still not ideal. The American Championship, for instance, gives you a first-gen Corvette as your prize car. Hardly much of a help at this point in the game. However, it isn't too hard to get an LMP in the grand scheme of things. You can of course just grind the Capri Rally and eventually buy one, or win one from the driving missions for example. However, another common way to acquire one is through the endurance races. Now unlike the games before this, GT4 actually puts a restriction on entry to the endurance events beyond just having the necessary license. This restriction is that you have to complete at least 25% of the game before you can enter. Most players will naturally leave endurance races until much later in their playthrough anyway, but this restriction means that you no longer have a choice. Again, this seems like another countermeasure put in place to prevent players from using the OP prize cars to completely break the game. Anyway, as for the races themselves, you'll now find ones lasting up to 24 hours. Of course, mimicking similar real-life endurance races. Considering that you still only have 5 opponents, and there's no changeable time or weather either, this was quite a bold decision. But when you have tracks like the Sarth and the Nürburgring at your disposal, I guess it makes sense. However, this is where B-Spec really comes into its own, as you're able to alternate between driving the car yourself and letting your B-Spec driver take over. I will be honest, I've never actually bothered with the 24-hour races in this game, but I have done many of the other Enduros. What I like to do is start the race myself and build up a decent lead, then hand over to my B-Spec driver who does the majority of the race. Given that they'll often fall back, especially if they're underleveled, I then take over the car for the final hour or so and charge back into the lead. Doing this makes these races go by far quicker and also makes them a lot more exciting. Try it out if you haven't already. When it comes to variables that make these races more interesting, tyre wear of course returns, and you're also given the ability to choose which tyre compound to fit at your pit stop. But that's not all, we also have fuel usage. Anyone who follows real endurance racing knows that cars will typically run out of fuel before they run out of tyres, so this is an important factor. Just like GT3, tyre wear and now fuel usage also appear in normal career mode races as well. However, unlike GT3, they're not given a multiplier, meaning that most races are too short for them to actually have much of an impact. The exceptions to this are the events in the late game, like the GT World Championship. Thankfully, Polyphony learned their lesson from GT3 about having too many excessively long championships in the late game, with the GT World Championship being one of the few exceptions. As such, it really stands out as a unique challenge in this game. It very much feels like the final boss. For me, the length of this event is just about perfect. It's long enough to make it challenging and bring strategy into the mix, but not so long that it becomes needlessly tedious. The challenge of this championship makes it easily my favourite event in this game, and one of my all-time favourites in the series. However, I do have one major gripe with it, and it's a pretty simple one. This event should have been in the Extreme League. You see, after beating this championship and reaching the end credits, you unlock the Extreme League. But the problem is that with the exception of the Formula GT Championship, all of the events here represent a noticeable step down in terms of length and difficulty. As such, from this point onwards, you're just treading water. These events do give you somewhere to use the higher end cars you might have earned earlier in the game, but that's about it. If the GT World Championship were in the Extreme League, this wouldn't be a problem, and it would also help to ease the insane difficulty spike too. Frankly, this makes far more sense to me, to the point where I almost think this was their plan initially before changing their minds late in development and putting it in the professional league instead. Because of this, GT3 and GT4 both have the same problem with their late games, but for drastically different reasons. In GT3, the high number of long and drawn out championships in the professional league meant that many players got bored and didn't bother with most of the events here. In GT4, the fact that the game effectively peaks with the GT World Championship means that a lot of players don't see any reason to continue in the game past it, regardless of how good the events in the Extreme League may or may not be. Honestly, it's quite interesting how the design of GT4 places so much importance on the GT World Championship. If you're like me and enjoy strategizing and planning out a route through these games, your playthrough will hinge almost entirely on this one event. It's not just about getting a fast enough car to beat it, but also how you unlock it in the first place, and then what you unlock from winning it. These might seem like minor decisions on the surface, but whether you realize it or not, these factors can completely change the way you play through this game. Was Gran Turismo 4 able to live up to its lofty expectations? Yeah, I think so. Being the 4th best-selling PS2 game ever doesn't just happen by accident. But what did people really think of it at the time? Well, the general consensus was that this was Gran Turismo at its Gran Turismo-iest, for lack of a better term. Effectively, everything that had been done so well in the previous games was turned up to 11. As the developers aimed to expand on everything GT3 excelled at, you would be hard-pressed to say that they failed in any area. However, there is one aspect where they did make a slight oversight. You see, in trying so hard to one-up themselves, they seem to forget about any potential opposition. As Gran Turismo effectively created its own subgenre, they had a pretty sizable head start on anyone else. This advantage was then re-established with GT3, where they were able to make full use of the new PS2 hardware. However, by the time of GT4, the playing field had become much more even, as any technical improvements yielded diminishing returns. As such, the reception towards GT4 was still very positive, but noticeably just a little bit muted compared to the first 3 games. The thing with this game was that, whilst it excelled at everything that Gran Turismo was traditionally the benchmark in, almost all of the complaints people had about those previous games could still be applied here. I'm talking about the absence of a damage model, the relatively poor AI, and a perceived lack of innovation. For some, the persistence of these problems, however minor, was starting to get a bit grating. It's almost as if Polyphony didn't really care that much about the feedback, and just did whatever they wanted to do. This was further compounded by the much anticipated online features, amounting to just a couple of closed test versions of the game. By 2005, new rivals had started emerging, namely Enthusia Professional Racing, and of course, Forza Motorsports. The latter of those really showed what Gran Turismo was lacking, with its full damage model, much deeper customization, and online play. Whilst GT4 still won out for most people, the alternatives showed that this series was capable of more. Whilst new features like B-Spec and photo mode were nice to have, they weren't really game changers, just fun options on the side. However, as time passes, people's perceptions of these games change as they begin to serve a different purpose. For example, no one is going back to a game from 2004 expecting innovation. So, if we once again consult my fan-voted poll, we can see that GT4 comes in a clear first place with a whopping 44% of the total votes. If you're at all aware of people's general opinions of these games, GT4 being ranked first here won't come as a surprise, although I will admit that I was caught off guard by just how much it won by. It has more votes than GT2, GT3, and GT5 combined. As for people's reasons for voting for it, much like GT3, it was hard to determine any one specific standout element. There were those who talked about the car and track selection, others the realism, and for some it was the career. As I mentioned, these are things that Gran Turismo has typically always done well, at least up to this point. But I think a big factor in why this game is so popular in current day is not about what it does well, but rather what it doesn't do well. Which is not much, really. I think it says a lot when one of the most controversial aspects of this game is the handling. Now, there are definitely complaints to be had, but at the same time, it's not terrible or anything. In fact, compared to most racing games from the time, it was still really good. In a way, I kind of think GT4 is the least offensive Gran Turismo. It just gives people the fewest reasons to dislike it. At the same time, it's also the final game in this series' golden era, which spans the PS1 and PS2 generations. It's no secret that for a lot of people, the series starts to decline from this point onwards, and so GT4 represents the apex of these games. From these first 4, it's the one with the most cars and tracks, it's the most realistic, and it has the most things to do. From that perspective, it's a no-brainer. But for me, it's just not that simple. Do any of you guys remember Classic Game Room? I used to binge watch his videos back in the day, particularly the ones about Gran Turismo. Anyway, there's something he said in his review of GT4 that's always stuck with me.
And I love Gran Turismo 4 so much that I could just hug this game. But also, I'm so disappointed with it, I could kick it.
This line resonated with me because, to a degree, I feel the same way. Something about GT4 has always seemed slightly off. Now, this is something that you won't be able to fully grasp unless you've played the games before this point in the series. With those titles, realism was never a question, and if it were, the answer would obviously be yes. However, GT4 is the first game in this series where I really start to ask whether striving for ultra realism is really worth it. I mean, just look at what they have to show for it. A somewhat awkward handling model and a washed out color palette. Is this really what people want, just because it's quote-unquote realistic? Of course, a lot of this will come down to personal preference, but for me, I've always felt like this game is slightly worse off because of it. I guess part of my disdain towards this is in how the series has now been consumed by realism, to the point where they now use it to justify making baffling design choices that don't improve these games in any way. Frankly, the tagline of this series should now be Gran Turismo because realism. Anyway, with GT4 this issue isn't so widespread, but I can't unnotice that this is where the trend really started. But hey, that is just a minor gripe in the grand scheme of things. So what is the one thing that keeps me coming back to GT4 above all else? Well, it's a tough decision, given that this game does so many things so well, but I'd have to say it's the tracks. GT4's track selection is easily my favourite in the entire series. What they did was take a solid selection of favourites from the older games, spoon in a nice helping of iconic real-world circuits, and then sprinkle a number of new and interesting original designs on top. To me, that is a near-perfect recipe for a Gran Turismo track list. The track roster was probably my biggest gripe with GT3, given how few new circuits there were and how overused they became in the career. This is not even close to a problem in GT4. In fact, there are some circuits that I wish I could drive even more often. For me, the new original ones are the clear standouts with their sheer variety and creativity, and for most of them, GT4 was the only mainline title they ever appeared in. Now, I obviously don't love every track here, but even for the ones I don't like that much, I can still appreciate them for at least being unique and interesting. And for the ones I do love, I couldn't really ask for more. In my opinion, there is no driving experience more enjoyable in these games than blasting through the narrow streets of a CC in a Delta S4 rally car. It is pure bliss. A great tracklist can elevate an entire game, and GT4 is a perfect example. I don't think I would enjoy playing through this game as much without these tracks. Even though it wasn't seen as such a revolution at the time, there's no doubt that GT4 has had a massive impact in the racing game community. It just has an undeniable charm and presence that's kept it relevant all these years later. Arguably, this game is more important in current day than it was back when it released. From the series' relatively humble beginnings, Gran Turismo 4 is the final flourish to one of the greatest runs in video game history.